This is the Legal Academy episode 16. This is going to be the final episode of the Legal Academy, or at least the final episode of this season. Maybe I'll come back and do another season next summer or at some future time. But in this episode, I wanted to just wrap up and offer some conclusions about what we've heard. I've received some really terrific feedback from people who've enjoyed episodes of the show, and a lot of times the feedback I get is along the lines of somebody just disagreeing with what somebody on the show has said, what a guest has said. And I often disagree with what the guests have said, or at least I come at things from a different perspective as well. So I thought it'd be helpful, given that for most of the time I've just been listening and asking questions, for me to offer kind of my own take on some of these questions. So what have we learned during this season? What have we learned during these series of episodes? So I think the biggest takeaway I have from it is that there are so many different ways of being a law professor. Part of that is just there are different roles, right? There's going to be the dean, think the Rodriguez episode, or the junior professor, think the Emma Kaufman episode, or the clinical professor, or the legal writing professor. There are going to be some places where the different positions are sort of almost like an institutional or career point role. But beyond that, I think just different professors have different views of what this job is. And there's no right or wrong answer. Some people are going to be focused on one kind of scholarship. Other people will be focused on another kind of scholarship. Some professors are scholars who happen to be teaching at a law school. Some professors are lawyers who happen to be scholars. There's no correct answer as to which of these is like the right way of doing it. It's just different ways of doing it. And so one lesson I take away from the series we've had is that it's just a matter of what you bring to the table. This is something you should think about. This is something that those of us that are fortunate enough to be in the Legal Academy should be pondering, thinking about. What is the right role for us? How should we approach these questions? How should we value scholarship? How should we value different kinds of scholarship and teaching and service? And I think there's just a lot of value in just thinking about these questions because they're so fundamental to who we are. Just the time pondering them and thinking about what we might want to do is valuable in and of itself. I think there are also really interesting differences in how we evaluate scholarship. And here I'll start with an observation. I've noticed over the years that whenever there's a discussion of a scholarship, it could be on an appointments committee, or it could be in the context of a group that's coming up with like who wins a prize for scholarship or something like that. There's a remarkable variation in attitudes towards what is a good article and what is a bad article. And it's sort of a fascinating there's a fascinating diversity of reactions. There's sort of no one who has work who everyone thinks is great. And there's no one who has work that everyone thinks is terrible. There's a lot of work that is just divides different audiences. Some people find it valuable. Other people find it don't valuable. And what that suggests to me is that different people are bringing in their different values to what they assess as being strong scholarship. Perhaps the most direct example of this is a few years ago, I was on a committee that was determining prizes for who should win scholarship prizes. And so, there were a bunch of professors in the field discussing individual articles. And it's just really interesting to hear different people react to an article. It might be one that you think is fabulous, and other people just say, well, that's not all that interesting. That's not all that important. That's not all that fundamental. And then another article that you think is really not impressive, and other people think, wow, that's incredible, that's a great article, I loved it. And why might that be? I think it's that we're just focused on different things that we find interesting and important. Part of that is just different problems. I think we have a sense of what are the important problems, what are the big issues in a given field that people should be spending time on, and we can just disagree on what those big problems are. And there's no sort of right or wrong answer to that. It's just, some people will say that's a big question. Some people say that's actually not that important. And we just disagree. And so I think we often will credit someone who's trying to answer a big question, an important question, and that just we're bringing in our instinctive senses of what is important and what is not important to that. I also think we just disagree on what the goals are of scholarship. For some, it might be doctrinal change. For some, it might be some theoretical point about the structure of law. For some, it might be an empirical point. There are all sorts of different goals of scholarship, and that means we can just look at the same article, and different professors will draw really different reactions from it, just depending on what goal they may be bringing, they may value. It just depends on how you're looking at the field. Is the field a set of social problems to be solved? Is it doctrines that need to be fit? Is it theoretical implications of certain parts of the doctrine that are interesting that relate to other doctrines in other fields? No right or wrong answer. Just we have different senses of that. A related point is, how do we feel about home runs versus singles, to use a baseball analogy? Some people will say we should you really value the big article that just has a major just is hitting for the fences, and it is offering a dramatic new way of thinking about a problem. And it may be wrong. There's actually a problem with this theory. And what do we think of that? Well, some people will say this was great. This was really thought-provoking and really made me think about this. And although I was ultimately not persuaded, there's still parts of this that I'm taking away from it, and that will be valuable. Others will say this didn't work, and therefore it wasn't valuable. It's only the value is in what actually works, not what aims for the fences and doesn't work. There's no right or wrong answer to that. It's just different values that we bring to the scholarly process. In a way, it's a lot like grading exams. Those of you that are professors and have graded exams know this. There's no such thing as the perfect exam. No matter how amazing a student is, the greatest student that ever was is not going to write an absolutely perfect exam, because it's effectively impossible in the usually the 3-hour time crunch of an exam. You can't achieve perfection. Every exam is flawed. Every exam has imperfections. And what grading is largely about is evaluating the various significance of the different imperfections. Comparing, one exam had the following 10 imperfections, the other exam had a different 10 imperfections. How important are those imperfections? How essential is getting that particular point right versus another point? And that's a judgment call that you're invariably coming into the grading process with a sense of this is what matters for this kind of exam, and you're just naturally going to have a sense of intuitively which imperfection is just not a big deal and which one is like a really, really fundamental point. And I think it's similar with evaluating scholarship. We just have intuitions about what matters and what doesn't matter, and what are major flaws and what are flaws that we'll excuse. And there's no right or wrong answer. We just approach these issues differently. So, in terms of how different people in the field react, or who ends up with a lateral position or something like that, a lot of it is just it's the mix of reactions that goes into any scholarly assessment of work, that it's just going to be mixed for everyone. There's no one who's going to get universal applause or universal lack of applause. So I think that's just the diversity of approaches we bring, which is, and I'm a pluralist on this issue, so I don't think that's a bad thing. I think it's perhaps inevitable, but also not a bad thing that we're bringing together all these different perspectives to problems. I do have a little bit. I'll give you my. Or I'm a pluralist, and yet, of course, I have my own take on what we should value, or at least what I think we should treat as ultimately the best scholarly work. And I'll offer two different thoughts on this question. First, I think we tend to overvalue the quality of work that is ideologically similar to our own. There's a very human instinct to say that if someone asked the kind of question that I wanted to ask and answered it in the way that I would have answered it, then that's great. That's a quality work. That's a wonderful work of scholarship. And we tend to give credit for asking the question framed in the way that we would ask it, and answered and using the same values that we have. And I think we tend to overvalue the scholarship that matches our priors and undervalue the scholarship that disagrees with our priors. And I got into this a little bit with in the Randy Barnett episode, where he was talking about how in constitutional law, scholars that are not originalists will not be interested in hiring an originalist, and maybe originalists would not be hiring if they had large numbers and hiring the non-originalists. It's sort of a sense of once you've gone through these issues and concluded I'm on one side of this debate, it's hard to weigh the work of those that are not on that side of the debate because you're sort of seeing it with your judgment in mind. Some of that I think is inevitable. We're assessing what we think is a good argument, and you don't want to hire people that don't make good arguments. At the same time, my bias on this, or at least my instinct on this, is that we will tend to see our quirky judgments as sound assessments of quality when it comes to those broader ideological questions, the things that are informed by these big picture debates, and that we can hire better by discounting those who agree with us and giving a plus to those who are disagreeing with us. I mean, I also feel a little bit this is true when I grade exams. I try to do the same sort of thing, where somebody tells me something that echoes what I might have suggested in class is my view, then I will discount that, because then it's I want to try to even out any bias I may have. I'm de-biasing myself by trying to look differently at what I myself think. But I think we can do better in evaluating scholarship by recognizing different priors, accepting those priors as plausible, and saying within that set of priors, here's where it goes, and we can value that work. I think that's something that it's hard to do. Don't get me wrong. It's not like this is just easy to do, but it's something that's really important when we're trying to assess the quality of scholarship, getting a little bit outside ourselves and being aware of our biases, so we're not just replicating ourselves and hiring people or valuing people that are just echoing what we're saying. You see a lot of that, I think, in academic hiring and in assessment of academic quality, and we should get away with that to the extent we can. You'll never have perfect neutrality, obviously, but to recognize the bias, I think, is a first step. A second thing that I think is a wise idea is, in general, I'm more in favor of schools doing lateral hiring rather than entry-level hiring, at least among those schools, the sort of quote-unquote higher-ranked schools that can hire either at the entry level or at the lateral level. I think in general, our system is one that lets people get on the tenure track, and in law schools the tenure rates are very high. In general, we let people get on the tenure track and have these very high tenure rates with a relatively thin record. This is something we talked about in the Brian Leiter episode. So people can go on the entry-level teaching market with just a few articles, one or two things, or maybe three things. They're getting a fellowship pretty early on. They're writing one other big article, maybe two other big articles. But we're having people get on the tenure track based on a very early showing of performance, and it's not a lot to go on. And so I think a lot of entry-level hiring it's based on promise, and it's based on hope. And in a world where tenure rates were lower, that would be pretty sensible. But the fact that tenure rates are so high means, to me at least, that from a hiring standpoint, I think schools should probably be less eager to hire at the entry level than at the lateral level. Now, obviously, someone has to hire the entry level, so it's not like it's not like this is true for no one, but for everyone rather. But for the schools that are in a position to decide, and in particular, I'm thinking like the higher ranked schools that are really, as a practical matter, able to pick from other schools and attract strong lateral hires. My own sense is that they can tend to hire a stronger faculty by waiting to see who excels upon being in academia and hiring people, whether it's right after tenure or after that. You sort of, once people have more of a track record, given the high tenure rates, I think it's a good strategy to hire more lateral candidates. And that lateral hiring should not be like entry-level hiring, where there's this tremendous focus on the job talk and sort of an initial impression of what someone looks like that moment. I think lateral hiring, people have a record. People have been doing what they do for a long time, and that it's important to de-emphasize the job talk, in part because there's a structural difference between how entry level hiring and lateral hiring works when it comes to job talks, which is that today, in a world of entry level hiring, it's a lot of fellowships, people coming from fellowships. They have typically spent 2 years preparing for the job talk. They have a paper which is like a good job talk paper, and for that, terrific advice in the Emma Kaufman episode, for how to think about what makes a good job talk paper. The folks on the entry level have a paper that has been selected to give a good job talk paper. They have practiced that job talk. They have gone back and forth with people that are in their VAP program typically, or something like that. They've spent a lot of time thinking about exactly how do you present this paper, and having a paper that's for it. Laterals, on the other hand, because a lateral call can come at any time, a lot of laterals are just, they're working on whatever they're working on, and they get a call. And the call might be, come in next month, present a paper for a lateral interview. And then, what does the lateral candidate have? Well, they'll have whatever they happen to have that they're working on at that particular time. Maybe what they have that they're working on is a book. Maybe it's a symposium article. Maybe they're taking time off to work on a treatise or, whatever, an amicus brief. And so laterals often come in with something that's, not for that. They have not spent a lot of time thinking about exactly what the paper should be. And so I've often seen, lateral job talks can often have someone who's very good, but just not in the zone, not ready, not practiced to give the job talk for purposes of evaluation that a lot of entry levels are. So I think that's another structural difference between the two. That when conducting lateral hiring, I think schools should tend to look more at laterals and should be more looking at the overall body of work of the lateral rather than just what somebody happens to present that particular day. Okay. I next wanted to talk about law school community, which is something that I have touched on in a bunch of episodes, going back to the first episode with Akil Amar. The question of what makes a law school a community and how to create a community in a law school is one that I think is important and is difficult. So I wanted to talk more about that. The problem is one that we talked about most in Randy Barnett's episode, which is that we live in a world where anyone can access Westlaw, all the books they need remotely. They can access interested colleagues, people who they want to talk to about the law remotely. They don't need to go down the hallway and ask a neighbor. And we also live in a world where people have busy lives, and the teaching load of most law schools is light relative to other institutions. Somebody might be teaching, say, 5 hours a week and add in office hours or something like that. Maybe that's 6 hours or 7 hours. There's a lot of time spent when somebody is not teaching and not in a meeting or faculty meeting or in office hours. Where do people spend that time? And the answer, I think, increasingly is a lot of people just spend that time at home. Now is a somewhat unusual time when people, have to spend time at home. It's actually illegal for me to go into the office right now because of COVID. But put that aside. Hopefully that will be behind us soon. We're in a world where it's easy to spend time working from home, and the benefits of going into the office and seeing other people in the hallway and talking to colleagues can be a little bit of an abstraction, or at least somewhat uncertain. You have to go and commute. You have to pay to park. You're walking to your office, and then you're in your office, and who knows who else is in the office, and who else you'll run into. And I think that's a problem. I think we'd be better off, or maybe not a problem. It's something which schools need to think about a lot, because to my mind, law schools should be more than just a collection of names or professors offering certain classes only to students enrolled in the institution. I think there's just a lot of value in a law school being some sort of collective entity with, if not a common voice, but a community, a group of different voices which know and respect each other and know the work and respect the work of each other and try to improve that work, and are learning from each other. I mean, I think we learn so much from that community, and that sense of shared purpose is so valuable that even in an environment where you can just be off doing your own thing, how to establish a community is I think really important. And what makes it tricky is there's no way of forcing faculty to be on campus and to participate and to be part of that community. At least once you have tenure. I guess if you're pre-tenure, you're worried, you want to be seen as a good citizen, and so you go to a bunch of things in order to be seen as being there. But when you're tenured, from then on in, you're kind of doing your own thing. And one of the remarkable aspects of this job is that people are not watching you to make sure you're there. They're not at least at most schools. At some schools, there are actually efforts to make sure different people are attending different things, and there's lists that are kept of who's present at various events. But usually, that's at least in my experience, it's not the case. And professors can just not show up, and that's fine. If you don't want to show up to different events, no one will stop you. And you can even, extreme case of this is, I've at various points had, sabbaticals, and you come back from a sabbatical and you realize, like, it's not obvious that anybody missed me. Or you see other people that were on sabbatical and they come back in and you're like, oh, I don't think I've seen that person in a while. And then they're like, oh yeah, I've been away for the last 4 months. It's like, oh, okay, well, welcome back. It's not required that you be present. Faculty lounges, another interesting example. In the old days, people would hang out at the faculty lounge. And this is like Randy Barnett's episode when he talked about at the beginning, there'd be like the law reviews selected by the librarians that would be in the faculty lounge. And I've been at institutions where there were those law reviews and it was selected by the faculty, not the librarians. But yeah, there's a common place where you would go. How do you have that common place when people are not coming into the office? How do you have that commonality? And one answer is food brings people together. So sometimes there'll be like a Wednesday bagel day and everybody comes in for bagels or something on a morning and every week, or some days when there will be food left in the faculty lounge. And I think that can be a great way of bringing people together because people will come in to get a bite to eat. Now, you'd hope they don't get a bite to eat and go back to their offices to eat, but at least something that will draw people to a common place can be valuable. But the broad question is, how do you create that sense of community in a world where people don't have to be a community anymore? They can do all of their work thanks to these computers like the one in front of me. You can do it all remotely. And what makes a law school more than that? So other than food, which I already mentioned, that's always a good answer. I think it should be incumbent on faculty members who are able to participate in the key parts of the life of the school. And that what those parts are can vary, but let me suggest ones that I think are particularly important. Perhaps the most important is most law schools will have some sort of a workshop series, paper presentations of people that are coming in either from other schools or presenting internally. I think it's just hugely valuable from a community standpoint to participate in those, to attend those. Ideally, to have read the paper and to offer comments and to help the person. And that is not only helping the author of the paper, it's helping your colleagues who are hearing your questions, and you get to hear those questions. By hearing the questions of others, you learn about different things that other people are interested in, get different perspectives on legal questions. So I think the audience for questions at a workshop, and this is a real workshop, not a job talk workshop, but like an actual improve the paper workshop. The audience is both the person presenting the paper and also your colleagues, the people in the room. who are sort of in conversation with each other. It's almost a little bit like a Supreme Court oral argument, where in theory it's the advocate who's presenting a case, but the justices are a lot of times sort of implicitly talking to each other. It's not quite that, but it's a little bit like that in a workshop where someone presents a paper, and then I enjoy knowing what my colleagues think about papers, because I learn from my colleagues' reactions to papers. Sometimes there's a literature I didn't know about. Sometimes there's a way of thinking about a problem. So the discussion and Q&A in a workshop is valuable, not just for helping that person's paper, but for sharing with colleagues what you care about and what you think about. And I think attending that kind of event is just hugely consequential. Also, student-focused events, participating in panels, being present for those sorts of things, not just the students who are teaching, but other students. I mean, I think it's incumbent on all of us to try, to the extent we can, to be active members of the law school community in order to enrich that community, to enrich the experience not only of the students, but of our colleagues and ourselves. And I think, creating that kind of culture is a challenge, but is really important. Let me talk a little bit about what I mean by culture. My sense is that whether a particular school has a strong community is largely a question of the culture at that institution. And I've been at institutions that had sort of a great community culture at some times, and maybe lost that community culture at other times. And so this can come and go. But I think that having a culture where it's expected or valued that someone is participating and is active is just really, really important. And I think a lot of times that message comes from a dean. We talked about in the Dan Rodriguez episode and in the Brian Leiter episode, roles of deans. And with the Brian Leiter episode, it was, how to constitute an appointments committee. That was one important role. But I think setting a tone for what a faculty values is something a dean does by the dean's actions. Is the dean attending workshops and asking questions? I think that's like a really wonderful thing for a dean to do. I realize deans are super busy, and not every dean is going to be able to pull that off. Not every faculty member is going to be able to pull that off. You might have little kids at home, or a super busy semester, or health issues. There are a million reasons why you can't do this. But to the extent you can, it's important, and I think a dean can kind of help set the tone for what is expected on a faculty. Most faculties, my sense is, what percentage participate in workshops, what percentage are not participating. Yeah, is it half or a third or something like that? It's it varies institution to institution and week to week. It's not like people can make every one. But I think it's one of those critical roles of deans and to a lesser extent associate deans. A lot of schools have associate deans for faculty development and the like, for scholarship, who are playing this role. They can play a role in this as well, although I do kind of think, at least my instinct is that the dean plays the major role in this, can help set the tone for what faculty are expected to do, not through orders, not through requirements, but just through norms, just through some sort of, the dean expressing views or showing up to certain things to indicate to the faculty, yeah, this is an important thing to do. And I think schools can create those cultures, or at least can make steps towards the creation of those cultures through steps like that. And I think it's important. Not only should schools, in terms of, we've talked a lot about the hiring market and hiring great scholars is obviously an important part of this, but creating a culture at the institution where participation, intellectual participation, being there and being engaged is valued, is something that I think is hugely important, and is hugely important for those that are interested in valuing that school. In terms of, if you're on the lateral market, or you have an offer from one school versus another school, I think that's one of those things that matters a lot. It's of course very hard to tell whether a particular school has that culture, because what will every law school say if you're on the market and you what's your school like? They will always use the collegial word. I don't know what it is. If it's like, it's like the rule of the legal academy. We are very collegial. Even if they're not collegial, they say we are collegial, and it's always that word. But although schools will often say that, you can, I think, get a sense from talking to people on a faculty about, how many people are showing up at the workshop, how active are the workshops, and just, to the extent you can sort of get a feel from people, maybe even people who've had offers there and said no or left that school, you can get a little bit of a sense of what's a collegial institution and what's not really a collegial institution. Or I guess I'm not going to use that word collegial. I'll say, what is a community? What is a place where people show up and like to show up and participate and like to participate, where they're not just at home all the time and they're not just seeing their colleagues as people that happen to have offices that they go to once in a while on the hallway from them. Creating that culture is important, and I think it is a question of culture, of community, that it's the responsibility of the dean and responsibility of all faculty members really to help foster. Okay, so those have been my thoughts. As I said, this is going to be the last episode of the Legal Academy, I think, but I may come back to it, and let me talk a little bit more about why. In terms of why this is the last episode, one reason is just that the semester is going again, and so I have a busy teaching load this semester, and so I don't have the time that I had over the summer to do these interviews because, of course, they take a certain amount of time to set up, to get sort of on board with a potential guest, and then to do the recording. It just takes time. So just a little short on time right now. That's one good reason. And also, I think I think this is up to you, not up to me, but I think we've covered kind of a range of different perspectives that give you different views to think about, ideas to chew on, and we've seen kind of a range of attitudes. There's more out there. There's a lot of different perspectives that could be presented, and if I come back and do a second round, maybe a season 2 next summer, we'll try more people and hear more about these things. But I think I've kind of covered a decent chunk of the different perspectives that are out there, and so I think it's just more valuable to present those views and call it a day, rather than to have additional guests that may just be kind of repeating what prior guests have said, or coming at things from more or less the same perspective. And I should add, I think there's some value in repetition, because if part of the goal of the series is to get different perspectives out there and to get kind of a reflection of who we are and how we think about things, hearing the same thing from different people tells you, oh, well, that's a view that's probably relatively widely held. And if no one agrees with a particular view that some prior guest said, then you can say, well, maybe that was just quirky to that individual or that school. And there are certainly a lot of perspectives in terms of different career paths, when people got into academia, perspectives of people that have left academia, emeritus professors. There are all sorts of different angles that could be pursued, which I might come back to. But I wanted to leave it here and have it sit there, and hope people enjoy the episodes and think back on them. And it's sort of like the goal of the Socratic method. I don't know if there's a great article by Phil Arita in the Harvard Law Review. I think it was after he passed away. He was a great Socratic professor, and it was actually his notes, if I recall correctly, for how to teach a Socratic class. And one of the things he said is that you're asking all these questions in order to internalize that those are the set of questions that should be asked. You're sort of teaching how to think like a lawyer, as the phrase goes, by always asking a set of questions, asking insightful questions in class, and then the student who's been in that class, who's worried, I don't want to get called on and not know the answer, is going to think about, well, what might the professor ask me? And so they start to ask themselves the same questions that the professor was asking. And the idea is that the Socratic form of asking questions can help teach people what questions to ask, and that helps sort of train their minds on the correct legal questions. So what I've done is not nearly as insightful or deep as that, but I hope, to the extent you found this valuable at all, that there's been a set of questions that I've tried to ask, getting at these issues of who we are and what should we be about. And I hope folks that are listening might be asking themselves those same questions and coming up with their own answers and discussing them with colleagues to come up with their own thoughts about what we're doing and how we could do better and how we could make law schools better and how we could make the experience of being a professor better and research better and all of the different things that we've talked about. So I hope you've enjoyed the show. I've enjoyed doing it. I learned a lot. I always looked forward to each episode. For me, it was great. I got to call up people I wanted to talk to and have conversations with them. And for me, that was great. Well, that's just a lot of fun. And I hope you enjoyed it too. Whether I have another season or stick with it just here, I hope you've enjoyed it and found it valuable. And if you do have thoughts or comments and want to send me an email, I've gotten some great email responses from people. Feel free. Would love to be in touch with people who had reactions. And then I should add at the very end of this, I have my the little, they call it the outro, the music, which you're about to hear. And then I say, rate this show wherever you rate podcasts. And I did that because at the beginning I had no idea where you rate podcasts. I had no idea. Like I said, one place is a lot of places. So I'm like, you'll hear it in a minute and you can laugh. I'm like, rate this show wherever you rate podcasts. So it turns out it's Apple Podcasts, and it's super easy. If you want to rate the show, you just click on whichever button you want to click on. And then you can add a comment. Not many people add comments, which is fine. But if you do want to add a comment, feel free. I guess this is valuable and that the higher rated shows come up sooner, or at least make me feel good. I actually don't know if there's any value in it, but I'll be watching and I'll feel happy about what I did if you rate it high. Okay, so now I will give you the outro music. I hope you enjoy it, and feel free to laugh at me when I say rate it wherever you rate podcasts. Be well, all.